Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of my podcast, English Sovereigns. In this episode, we shall be talking about King Alfred the Great, whose sole claim to fame nowadays is that he burnt some cakes. There is far more to him than that. It is somewhat regrettable that the one thing that everyone knows about Alfred the Great is that he burnt some cakes. While the moral of this story is instructive, namely that you shouldn't overthink stuff because things you're actually doing might be going awry or astray, Alfred did not actually burn the cakes, or at least there's no primary documentary evidence to support that. The first story about it appearing, I think, about 100 years after his reign. So that's that settled. He did a lot more than that. So Alfred was the first, or indeed, he was the first king to be called the Great. The only other king being called the Great was Canute, and I disagree with that title, I think. But we'll get to him in due course. And Alfred is thoroughly deserving of that epithet. However, his reign did not start that way in the slightest, really. He lost to the Great Heathen Army at the Battle of Wilton in the town of Wiltshire pretty much immediately after becoming king. After this, he negotiated with the new leadership of the Great Heathen Army to buy them off and say, stop invading us, please. Which they stuck with. So as I said, the Great Heathen Army had changed leadership. Ivor had gone to Ulster and had perished there in the year 873. Halfdan had gone to Scotland and then to Dublin to claim the throne there. He died in 877, and Bjorn, who was the eldest son, just returned to Sweden, but I assume he wasn't idle there because after all he's a Danish warrior. So this peace was largely successful into the year 876, where Guthrum, who was the new leader, along with Ubba, who obviously was still sticking around, they had invaded Wareham, but this was easily repelled because allegedly there was very, very bad weather, which washed a lot of Viking ships ashore. That was obviously a godsend for Alfred because they probably wouldn't have combated that army very well had it arrived in its full force successfully on the English shore. So another peace took hold, but this lasted only about 2 years, where Guthrum surprisingly broke it, and quite audaciously broke it, by surprise attacking Alfred at his royal residence of Chippenham over, I think it's the festivity of Passover, or in January 878. Alfred only just escaped with his life with his family, using his superior knowledge of the geography of Wessex to get to the Somerset marshes, where he plotted his comeback in Athelney, which is now no longer marshland. You can visit it. I think there was a monastery there. But yeah, Alfred spent a lot of time here, about 4 months, contemplating what it was he was going to do next. And one of the things he did was write to his nobles to say, I'm still alive, summon your men, because Wessex will stand and fight another day. If you don't, we will become a province of Denmark, which he was very right to probably say, if indeed he did say it in those words. He also conducted a small guerrilla war in that he obviously needed some food, so he attacked Danish foraging parties. And this kind of showed the Danes that they were still around and they weren't completely defeated, the Anglo-Saxons, which was, again, quite useful. So at Egbert Stone in Wiltshire in May 878, all the Wessex forces congregated, and they met Guthrum's army, the Great Heathen Army, in May 878 at the Battle of Eddington in Wiltshire, and Alfred decisively won that battle. I don't think it cannot be overstated enough how important this battle is for the future of England, because if Alfred lost, without doubt, England would have become a province of Denmark, and history would indeed be very different. But I guarantee you, if you've not watched The Last Kingdom, or you hadn't known too much about Anglo-Saxon history, or you had known a bit about Anglo-Saxon history, you would not have heard of the Battle of Eddington, and I hadn't heard of it until I'd watched The Last Kingdom. But it's so important. We're not taught about it at all. We're taught, Hastings is where English history begins in 1066, but it's not. Eddington was such a crucial battle for the history and the future of England as we know it. Guthrum, as a result of this battle, was forced to become a Christian, adopting the name Ethelstan, and he became the king of East Anglia on cordial terms with King Alfred. And the frontier between the West Saxons and the Danelaw, as it was now called, was established among Watling Street, which kind of meant that Mercia, or at least Western Mercia, became not part of Wessex, but became side by side with Wessex, where Wessex was clearly the primus inter pares, the first among equals. There were further Danish engagements, such as in the 880s, where Alfred was able to expel the Danes from London, which was previously a Mercian province, but as I said just now, Wessex was, predominant in a relationship with Mercia, so basically annexed London for Wessex. And then in 892, another Danish fleet had invaded, and his son, Edward the Elder, who would succeed him in 899, was able to defeat the Danes at the Battle of Farnham in the year 892. One of the reasons why the Danish raids became less frequent, yes, was because he had made peace with Guthrum, and also Ubba himself had died at the Battle of Sinuit I think it's in Dorset, near Swanage, and he was slain there. So the Great Human Army leadership was essentially spent. But the point is, one of the other reasons, really important reasons why Alfred is called the Great and the Danes did not invade as much anymore, was that he began to build things called burhs, which are also called fortified towns in sort of the English we speak today. And these had walls. These towns had walls around them. Because previously the Danes could just walk into any open town, which was most towns in England, and could just take what they wanted because there was no defence. But having a defence there was super important, because the Danes were not equipped for sieges. The Danes were warriors. They wanted to attack in an open field where they could win quite easily, which obviously, as we've said in previous podcasts, has happened a lot. But having walls there meant it was too expensive for manpower, for time, and indeed for money too, to besiege a town for a long amount of time, especially when Alfred had also built things called herepaths, which are kind of like, I always thought they were tractor paths, but if you go to southern England, sort of the home counties, you will see sort of two small paths side by side with a small bit of grass running in between it. And these were Alfred's invention to get the armies, in case the Danish army did besiege a burh, it would get the West Saxon armies there quickly to relieve the siege, which again was another good innovation of Alfred. So the Danes kind of recognised this and thought, okay, it's too expensive to invade Wessex again, so we're going to go to Francia, which was kind of good for Alfred because it meant that Wessex would become more prosperous, which indeed it did, because not only did the fortified towns protect against the Danes in a sort of human sense, but in an economic sense, it was really useful too, because traders knew that they could go about their business without the hindrance of the Danes suddenly coming in and killing them, which is probably quite helpful for trade, don't you? Other key moments in Alfred's reign was when he wrote a law code. I'm not sure precisely when this was, but yeah, he wrote a very comprehensive law code, which was largely based on Christian teachings. But this was helpful because it meant that he could centralise power further in his own hands. But not only that, he made his nobles, and indeed anyone who was in a position of authority, and I think even peasants, or serfs as they were called back then, he made as many people as possible literate in Old English, because he wanted them to understand the laws that he was passing, and because he thought the laws he was passing were the word of God, he wanted his own people to understand in writing the word of God. I mean, you could argue this is a sort of very, very early form of, not Reformation, Protestant Reformation kind of thing, but, translating texts like the Bible into English and various other religious texts into English was kind of predated Martin Luther by a good 700 years, even though obviously he wasn't trying to break away from the Catholic Church at all. But these two things, literacy and law code, went hand in hand. Obviously, Alfred's victories at Essendon and all his other achievements meant that the Pope had a lot of admiration for him, and because the prestige of the House of Wessex had drastically increased, so the Pope gave him a piece of the True Cross, which Jesus supposedly died on, which is not something that's usually awarded to a king. So Alfred had clearly done God's work in expelling the pagan Danes from at least Wessex and bits of Mercia. However, Alfred's most essential contribution, and why I think he is truly deserving of the epithet the great was that the idea of England began with Alfred. He wanted a union of all the Christian, Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking peoples under one king, which no one had thought about before. I'm sure Alfred thought he was doing God's work when he thought, oh, we must pursue an England. But he probably was also a realist in the sense that he saw what had happened when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were disunited, when, you had the Heptarchy, you had, like Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, Essex, you had all these countries, small kingdoms, warring against one another, and Danes could just come in and rip everyone to shreds, which they very, very nearly did. Alfred's dream would be continued, because it obviously hadn't come to fruition yet, and he called himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, I think, from the 880s onwards, but he didn't call himself King of the English. That title would be awarded to Aethelstan, his grandson, after the work of both Alfred, his son Edward, and then Aethelstan himself in getting to England. But the dream began with him, and more importantly, the dream could actually start to grow because of him and his victory at Eddington, and then also his building of the Burhs and his other achievements. Not the burning of the cakes, though. Let's not talk about that anymore. Yes, so that is largely all there is to say about Alfred. I could go on for further because he did some other things, but they're not as significant. But yes, I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. It's certainly been the longest podcast, and I really find Alfred such a fascinating historical figure. And you could argue maybe he was the founder of England. Food for thought. Thanks very much. Goodbye.